Africa is at a historic moment as the continent assumes the presidency of the G20. Well, I spoke to Dr. Daouda Sembene, CEO of AfriCatalyst, and Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, the CEO for the South African Institute for International Relations, to get a feel of what will be Africa's key priorities going forward.
We are at the historic moment where Africa is assuming the presidency of the G20 through South Africa this year. So it means that it is a unique opportunity for the continent to make sure that its priorities in terms of economic development are very much front and center of the G20 agenda. So definitely there has been a number of priorities that many of our countries do have, and South Africa has done a great job of making sure that those are reflected in the priorities that it has submitted to the G20. And this include, of course, issues around mobilizing finance for development and climate actions, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth, but also debt sustainability. As you know, debt is a big issue for many African countries. And South Africa also championed the idea that the G20 needed also to discuss about how we can get a fair and just energy transition. So all of those are key priorities that the continent actually has, and that are thankfully reflected in the current agenda of the G20, thanks to the presidency of South Africa.
Quite some critical points you just brought out there, Daouda. Allow me to bring in Elizabeth, because South Africa's presidency of G20 is coming to a close in November. I'd like to know from your perspective, what are some of the key priority issues that will be among the big takeaways, and what should Africa prioritize with going forward so that they don't lose the momentum they've already built?
The Leaders' Declaration is currently being negotiated. We're hoping that a lot of the priorities that Daouda mentioned of the South African presidency will make it into the declaration, but also will make it into the declaration with some very specific and concrete outcomes. I think that's important. It's not simply about expressing sort of support. It really is actually seeing that manifest itself concretely. But notwithstanding what comes out of the Leaders' Declaration, I think what has been extremely positive in the way in which South Africa has engaged this year is really to put on the global agenda and to create greater awareness and start shifting the discourse on many of these fundamental challenges that are important to Africa and that require global solutions. And one very good example that I think most people will quote in the future really relates to the conversation about the cost of capital. And this is something that has been taken up both in the Sherpa track of the G20 as well as in the finance track, that when we talk about debt, when we talk about development finance, we really have to factor in a whole host of global structural issues that impact on the way in which African countries are able really to fund their development. And I think that push this year, which also builds on conversations and discourses that have happened earlier, in which civil society and organizations such as SAIIA, AfriCatalyst, etc., have been engaging on for some time. I mean, AfriCatalyst in particular, around credit rating agencies, the work that they're doing in that regard. This is now, I think, one can really say that this year this is all coming to a head. And regardless of what comes out, the conversation is not going to end there. And I think that relates then to your last point about, how do we keep the momentum going? Well, we've built it up, and I think this year, the fact that the AU is in the room as a formal member, the fact that this is an African presidency driven by South Africa, I think has enabled great momentum. And so in 2026, 2027, I think all actors in the African community, but not only in the African community, also beyond that identify with many of these priorities that South Africa has set out and that are important for Africa, can be mobilized. And we can develop friends of Africa in terms of pushing some of these issues forward. And we, of course, as think tanks, as knowledge knowledge community within the continent also have a particular responsibility to keep that conversation going.
Well, Dr. Daouda, you have been extremely instrumental in terms of shaping this global discourse around affordable finance for Africa. And looking at the G20, how can it help, especially when it comes to ensuring that the African agenda is not lost and we are able to access fairer and more competitively priced financing?
Yeah, I think I would definitely echo what Elizabeth said earlier. The G20 is the place where certainly Africa needs to bring on the agenda issues that requires global solutions. So when you face issues around the cost of capital and you want to make sure that actually you address all of those factors that global challenges that are very much contributing to it, the G20 is certainly the right place to discuss about that. And South Africa has understood that and has brought those issues to light. So where we definitely would expect action from the G20 to really make sure that Africa has access to affordable financing for development and climate action is to very much advance and accelerate the reform of the global financial architecture, which we all understand has some bearing on the cost of capital for developing countries, particularly those in Africa. When we talked about reforming the global financial architecture, it has many sort of, it's a multi-dimensional sort of process. It requires, first of all, understanding how to improve the assessment, the pricing, and the mitigation of risk, because this is also one issue that many African countries are facing that is contributing to the high cost of borrowing that they do have. So it means when you want to do that, you have to bring in the conversations the multilateral development banks, because those are very much trusted with hopefully helping de-risk investment in Africa and across the global south. It means that we need to make sure that those institutions are less risk averse and make sure that we give them additional lending resources, but loan resources, but under the condition that they use it effectively without necessarily actually, being subject to some undue risk aversion. So this is something that has been ongoing at the G20 for a while, and under the South African presidency of the G20, we are hoping that quick action happens. But it's not only the multilateral development banks that needs to be, of course, dealt with. Other actors like credit rating agencies need to also to be, engaged, because when we are talking about risk, I think the work of credit rating agency may have some bearing if that's not done in an objective manner. This is something that there is increasingly some discussion around it, and there is increased engagement around it, and the G20 should really play a very constructive and positive role in making sure that credit rating agencies, government, and other actors in the ecosystem get together and find ways to make sure that the credit rating agencies continue to do their work, which is, of course, very valuable, but in a way that does not unnecessarily penalize African countries and developing countries in general. I think this is critical. So that's definitely a set of action that are needed that would very much help make sure that the G20 addresses all of those priorities that we talked about earlier that South Africa is trying to champion during its presidency.
Fantastic. And just a follow-up question to Elizabeth. Of course, listening to Daouda, one gets the notion that given the low credit ratings, which is costing Africa billions annually, so how do you ensure that these discussions are implemented, especially when it comes to coming up with concrete, measurable reforms that will ensure Africa gets a fairer assessment?
Recognizing, for example, particularly with international financial institutions, the fact that there are structures and governance processes in place that where Africa itself doesn't have the overbearing voice. It's where it's important really to build up partnerships and identify actors, countries, within those institutions where with which we have agreement on a number of issues that require reform. We know that we've entered a very difficult period in multilateralism. The whole concept, I think, of international cooperation as a public good to help the world deal with all its existential challenges is really being seriously undermined and questioned. And I think there is a sense, part of which has, I think, come from the fact that in many instances over the last several years, the multilateral frameworks haven't necessarily delivered. But at the same time, it is also a response to the way in which people feel that they can solve problems by just focusing on themselves. That if the approach is a zero-sum game, then I don't need international cooperation. That's really, really dangerous because we're all living in one planet. We all face the same challenges, and we all need to work together. There are many actors, many countries in the world today who I think believe in the same way that African countries and the AU believes in the importance of multilateral cooperation. And so we need to amplify those voices, both within the continent and beyond. But critical to that is we actually also are now being called to show very, very concretely that multilateralism can deliver, that the WTO, that has been paralyzed on some issues can actually drive global trade, that the various development finance institutions can actually build up the amount of capital that is available to fund development. That the special drawing rights in the IMF can actually also be utilized in an environment where we need so many resources to do good, to help drive development. And I think so it's important to build up partnerships, but also to make sure that those partnerships can drive forward very, very concrete actions that show the value of international cooperation.
Indeed, your point is well noted. And finishing this off, of course, Daouda, it will be unfair for us not to talk about the green transition. This has been an area that can unlock significant funding for Africa. Africa is bearing the brunt when it comes to climate action. Perhaps what would be your closing thoughts on this?
We all know that Africa, unfortunately, at this stage, is very much receiving very limited resources from green markets, from green financial institutions. It is estimated that out of global climate flows, Africa receives less than 5%, which is very much limited. So how do we make sure that we reverse that trend? I think that's the key issue that certainly the G20 may need to address during this South African presidency. Of course, there are some other more domestic reasons, domestic issues that needs to be addressed at the country level. This include of making sure that you make the necessary reform to the financial sector so that they can very much attract more green finance. You can also think there is a role for policy to very much play so that the business environment is more attractive in terms of green finance. But there are many global challenges that limits the ability of African countries to access to global flow of climate finance, and that to address them is not going to be individually that those countries can do it. They need to the G20 to contribute and to support. And I think this is where it is important that during the discussion, particularly later this month at the head of state level, these issues are addressed. So now we have to understand that the current context that we are facing is not always favorable. There are major G20 members that are not necessarily actually seeing the issue the same way as us, and in terms of recognizing and acknowledging the importance of